There's a tablet in the British Museum that museum curators rarely discuss in detail. It lists 5 cities. Just 5. Before anything else, before recorded history as we commonly understand it, these 5 cities existed. According to the Sumerians themselves, these weren't just the first cities. They were the only cities when kingship descended from heaven. The tablet is called the Sumerian King List, and what makes it remarkable isn't just its age, nearly 4,000 years old, carefully inscribed in wedge-shaped cuneiform. What's remarkable is what it says happened after these 5 cities, after Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppac. After kingship had passed through each of them in turn, the text states something simple and devastating. Then the floods swept over. Every civilization that followed, every king who ever ruled Mesopotamia, every scribe who ever pressed a stylus into wet clay, they all looked back to these 5 cities as the foundation of everything. Not metaphorically, literally. These were the places where civilization itself was born. And more intriguingly, according to the texts, these 5 cities weren't chosen randomly. They were given, each one assigned by the gods to a specific deity, each one with a specific purpose, each one part of a careful, deliberate plan. Tonight, as the day fades and your thoughts begin to slow, I'm going to take you back to those ancient cities, to a time measured not in years but in Sar, periods of 3,600 years. To a world where the Anunnaki walked among mortals, where the boundary between heaven and earth was as thin as morning mist. Close your eyes if you'd like, you won't need to see anything. The world I'm building exists better in shadow, in the space between memory and history. Let the story unfold at its own pace, and if sleep finds you somewhere along the way, that's exactly where you're meant to be. Before we go deeper, a quiet light helps others find these ancient mysteries. I'm curious, where in the world are you listening from tonight? What time is it there? Leave a thought in the comments if you'd like. And remember, the visuals are here only to add context. This journey works just as well, perhaps better, with your eyes closed and your mind adrift. Now, let's begin at the beginning, at the very first city, the one the Sumerians themselves believed was the birthplace of everything. The air would have tasted different there, saltier, wetter. You're standing at the edge of where land meets water, where the Euphrates River, still young and wild in those days, spreads into countless channels, creating a vast marshland that stretches to the horizon. The reeds tower above your head, whispering secrets in a language older than words. The ground beneath your feet isn't quite solid. It's that peculiar Mesopotamian mud, dark and rich, the kind that holds the footprints of ancient gods. This is Eridu, the first city, the firstling, as the texts call it. Modern archaeologists know it as Tel Abu Shahrain, a lonely mound in southern Iraq, about 15 miles from where the ancient city of Ur once stood. But you're not seeing the ruins. You're seeing it as it must have been when it was everything, when it was the only city in the world. The Sumerian king list is unambiguous about this. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Not Uruk, not Ur, not any of the great cities that would follow. Eridu. According to their own records, this is where it all began. Kingship civilization, the organized gathering of human beings into something more than scattered tribes. It started here in the marshes, in a place so close to the primordial waters that the connection between myth and landscape becomes almost tangible. The patron god of Eridu was Enki, called Ea in later Akkadian, the god of the deep freshwater ocean, the Abzu, the god of wisdom, of magic, of creation itself. The Sumerians believed that beneath the earth, beneath the surface we walk on, there existed a vast ocean of fresh water. This wasn't the salt sea. This was sweet water, life-giving water, the source from which all fertility sprang. And Enki lived there, in the depths, in the Abzu. Eridu was built directly above his realm. This geographical detail is crucial. Eridu wasn't chosen arbitrarily. Look at the archaeological evidence. The site sits in a natural basin fed by underground springs. Even today, even after millennia of geological change, fresh water still seeps up through the earth there. The ancient Sumerians would have seen this as proof, tangible evidence that Enki's domain lay just beneath their feet, that the boundary between the mortal world and the divine realm was thinner here than anywhere else on earth. The temple at the heart of Eridu bore a name that captures this perfectly: Abzu, the house of the aquifer, the house of the deep ocean. Excavations have revealed that this wasn't a single building, but a succession of temples, each built directly on top of the ruins of the last, stretching back through the millennia. The earliest structure, level CV8 in the archaeological sequence, dates to approximately 5,400 years before the Common Era during the early Ubaid period. It was little more than a modest room, a simple mud brick chamber with a niche for offerings and a small altar. Archaeologists found extensive deposits of fish bones scattered around that altar, evidence that suggests the priests of Enki offered their god the fish that swam in the marshes just outside their door. This pattern of fish offerings, continuing through the earliest levels, hints at the deep antiquity of the Abzu cult associated with Enki. Over the centuries, over the millennia, that simple room grew. Each generation built larger, more elaborate. The temple expanded, rising higher, its foundations sinking deeper into the earth, as if the building itself was reaching simultaneously toward heaven and down into the Abzu. By the time the Earth Tree dynasty ruled Mesopotamia, around 2100 years before our era, a massive ziggurat crowned the site. King Unamu himself oversaw its construction, a testimony to Eridu's enduring sacred significance even after it had long ceased to be a political power. But let's return to the beginning, to those first kings. The Sumerian king list tells us that two rulers governed Eridu before kingship moved elsewhere: Alulim, who reigned for 28,800 years, and Alalgar, who held power for 36,000 years. These numbers are staggering, impossible by any conventional human measure. Mainstream scholars interpret them as symbolic, viewing them as mythological inflation meant to convey the immense antiquity and divine favour of these rulers, or perhaps representing entire dynasties rather than individual lifespans. But the texts themselves don't present these figures as metaphor. They record them with the same bureaucratic precision used for historical kings whose reigns we can verify archaeologically. This raises questions that resist easy answers. If we allow for the possibility that the scribes were attempting to record something real, however incomprehensible to us, what might these numbers represent? The Eridu Genesis text explicitly states that the mother goddess Ninta gave the firstling of cities to Nudimud, another name for Enki. Based on this, one interpretation suggests Eridu was Enki's city, ruled by his appointed representatives. If these early kings were something other than fully mortal, if they occupied some intermediate status between human and divine as the text seemed to imply, then conventional assumptions about time and lifespan might not apply to them in the same way. The archaeological record tells us that Eridu was founded around 5,400 years before the Common Era, during what scholars call the Ubaid period. It was built on virgin sand, on a dune that had never been occupied before. Someone, something, chose that exact spot with deliberate intention. The city grew steadily through the Uruk period, reaching its height during the early dynastic era. But here's what's fascinating. Even after Eridu lost all political importance, even after other cities like Ur and Uruk eclipsed it completely, it retained an almost mystical prestige. Kings from distant cities would travel to Eridu to worship at the Abzu. They would rebuild its temples, restore its walls, make offerings to Enki. Why? Because Eridu represented something irreplaceable. It was the foundation. The first place where the divine plan touched the earth. The city where knowledge itself was born. Enki, you see, wasn't just the god of water. He was the god of wisdom, of crafts, of all useful knowledge. The myths tell us that he held the me, the fundamental decrees or principles that governed civilization itself. Scholars continue to debate what the me actually were. Some texts describe them as if they were tangible objects that could be given, worn, or stolen. Other passages treat them as abstract concepts or divine powers. They encompass everything from the knowledge of kingship and priesthood to the practical skills of writing, metalwork, and agriculture. Whether literal artifacts or conceptual frameworks, the me represented the essential components of civilized life, and according to the mythology, they originated with Enki. They flowed from Eridu. There's a famous Sufi preserved in Sumerian poetry of how the goddess Inanna travelled from her own city of Uruk to visit Enki in Eridu. She found him in a generous mood, loosened by beer, and through a combination of charm and cunning, managed to convince him to give her dozens of the me. She loaded them onto her boat and sailed back to Uruk before Enki sobered up and realised what he'd done. This myth, humorous as it sounds, encodes a profound historical memory. The spread of civilization from Eridu to other cities. The transfer of knowledge. the migration of cultural practices. Eridu was the source. Everything else flowed outward from there. You can still feel it if you visit the site today. The mound rises quietly from the flat desert plain, unremarkable to the untrained eye. But beneath that earth lie 18 distinct layers of occupation, each representing centuries or millennia of continuous habitation. Excavations conducted by Iraqi archaeologists Fuad Sippar and Seton Lloyd between 1946 and 1949 revealed this remarkable stratification. At the very bottom, at the foundation of everything, archaeologists found that simple mud brick room from the early Ubaid period, with its cult niche and offering table, surrounded by those ancient fish bones, the first temple, the first house of God, the place where, according to the people who built it, civilization itself was born. But Eridu couldn't remain alone. The experiment, if that's what it was, needed to expand. And so kingship moved. It was transferred, the texts tell us, to a second city, a place with a name that reveals its purpose, Bad Tibira, the Wall of the Metalworkers. If Eridu was the place of sacred knowledge, Bad Tibira was the place of sacred craft. The name itself is telling. Bad means fortress or enclosure. Tibira means coppersmith or metalworker. This wasn't just a city. It was a workshop, a factory, a centre of technological innovation that the ancient world had never seen before. The modern site is called Tel al-Medina, located between Ash-Shatra and Tel Sankara in southern Iraq, about 25 kilometres southwest of ancient Gersu. The identification is relatively secure based on foundation cones and inscribed bricks that were, unfortunately, looted from the site in the early 20th century before proper archaeological excavations could establish the full context. But what those artefacts tell us is extraordinary. Bad Tibira was given to dual deities. The Eridu Genesis specifies that the second city was given to the prince and the sacred one. These are epithets for Dumuzi the shepherd and his consort Inanna. Dumuzi, who would later be called Tammuz, was a god of fertility, of shepherds, of the natural world, but he was also, according to the Sumerian king list, one of the antediluvian kings. He reigned in Bad Tibira for 36,000 years. Think about what this means. A god who is also a king, a divine being who took physical form, who ruled over a city, who oversaw the development of metallurgy, because that's what Bad Tibira specialised in. The archaeological evidence, limited though it is, shows clear signs of early metalworking. Arsenical copper objects have been found dating to the Jemdet Nasr period, around 2,900 years before the Common Era. These weren't crude tools, they were sophisticated implements, showing advanced understanding of alloying and casting techniques. The city's main temple was called Imush Kalama, dedicated to both Inanna and to Dumuzi, under his local title Lugal Imush, the king of the Imush temple. Various historical inscriptions tell us that rulers from other cities, particularly from Lagash, took great care to build and rebuild this temple. Entemena, a governor of Lagash around 2,400 years before the Common Era, left foundation cones describing his construction of the Imush temple for the goddess Inanna and the god Lugal Imush. These aren't mythological texts, they're administrative records, receipts from the ancient equivalent of construction projects. But here's where it gets stranger. The site shows evidence of catastrophic destruction by fire. Vitrified bricks, melted and fused by incredible heat, are scattered across the surface of the main mound. Archaeologists note this kind of vitrification typically requires temperatures far exceeding those of normal building fires. What happened at Bad Tibira? Was it conquered and burned by an enemy? Was it struck by something from above? The texts don't say. They simply record that after the three kings ruled there for a combined 108,000 years, kingship was transferred again. Dumuzi himself appears in another context in Sumerian mythology. The poem Inanna's Descent to the Netherworld tells how demons from the underworld came looking for someone to take back with them. They first approached the patron god of Bad Tibira, a deity named Lulal, but found him dressed in sackcloth, sitting in the dust, mourning. The demons spared him because he showed proper respect for Inanna's suffering in the underworld. But when they found Dumuzi, he was sitting on his throne in fine robes, seemingly unconcerned, so they seized him and dragged him to the netherworld. This myth has been interpreted many ways, but one reading is particularly relevant to our story. Dumuzi, the king of Bad Tibira, was taken. His reign ended not in death by natural causes, but by a forcible removal to another realm. And after that removal, Bad Tibira was abandoned. The kingship moved to the third city. Larak. Larak is the most mysterious of the 5 cities. Unlike the others, it has never been definitively identified by archaeologists. The site might be Tel al-Wilaya near Kut or possibly Tel al-Hayad in Wasit Governorate, but we don't know for certain. What we do know comes entirely from textual sources. The Sumerian king list, the Eridu Genesis, and scattered references in later lamentations, and literary compositions. The Eridu Genesis tells us that Larak, the third city, was given to Pabilsag. This is a fascinating deity. Pabilsag was a warrior god often identified or syncretized with Ninurta, the great champion of the gods. But Pabilsag had additional associations that made him unique. He was a god of judgment, of medicine, of healing. His wife was Ninisina, also called Gula, the supreme healing goddess of the Mesopotamian pantheon. And crucially, Pabilsag had connections to the netherworld, to the realm of the dead. Only one king is mentioned for Larak in the Sumerian king list, Ensipad Zid Anna, whose name means something like the true shepherd of An. He ruled for 28,800 years before kingship moved to the 4th city. Some later versions of the king list give him 13,800 years, but the symbolism is the same. This was a city of healing and judgment, ruled by a shepherd who served the sky god An. Why would healing be important enough to warrant an entire city? Why would the 3rd city in the divine plan be dedicated to medicine and judgment? The answer might lie in what came before. If Bad Tibira was a place of metalworking, of technological advancement, of the transformation of raw materials into tools and weapons, then Larak might have been a necessary correction. A place to heal the wounds that technology creates. A place to judge whether the advancements were being used properly. The texts tell us that Pabilsag was portrayed as a high administrative official in later periods, a Zazaku in Akkadian, a kind of high judge or chancellor. By Hellenistic times, he was depicted as a centaur, half human and half horse, sometimes with a scorpion's tail. He became associated with the constellation Sagittarius, a archer, a hunter, someone who sees far and strikes true. Larak appears in later Sumerian lamentations as a city that was destroyed and abandoned. The lament for mentions Ninashti, the goddess of the city, abandoning her house in Larak, her sheepfold, to the wind. Another lament has Inanna crying out, "From my brickwork of Larak he called out after me," referring to the destruction of her temples by some unnamed enemy. By the 1st millennium before the Common Era, there are references to a city called Larak in Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian texts, but scholars debate whether this was the same Larak or a completely different city that happened to share the name. The mystery of Larak is fitting in a way. It was a city of healing, but also of secrets. A city of judgment, Tindin, where things were weighed and measured. A city that, unlike the others, left almost no physical trace. As if it was meant to remain hidden, to exist more as an idea than as a place. The shepherd of An watching over his flock, tending to them, judging them, healing them, then vanishing, like morning mist when his work was done. But the work of civilization continued. Kingship moved again, this time to a city of light, to Sippar. You would have seen Sippar long before you reached it. Not the walls, not the buildings, but the glow, the reflection of sunlight off its most famous structure, the temple Ebabra. The name means shining house or white house, and it was dedicated to Utu, the sun god, called Shamash in Akkadian. Sippar was a city of illumination, both literal and metaphorical, a city of justice, of truth, of everything that sunlight represents. The modern site is Tel Abu Haba, about 69 kilometers north of ancient Babylon, 30 kilometers southwest of Baghdad. It's one of the better excavated of the antediluvian cities. Hormuzd Rassam led excavations there in the 1880s, recovering tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets. Many were administrative records, the daily business of temple and palace. But among them was something extraordinary, the tablet of Shamash. This stone monument, now in the British Museum, shows the sun god seated on his throne inside a shrine, holding the rod and ring of justice. Before him stands a king, receiving divine authority. It's one of the masterpieces of ancient Near Eastern art, a perfect encapsulation of what Sippar represented. Divine law given to mortal rulers, heavenly justice implemented on earth, the sun that sees everything, that exposes all hidden things, that makes right judgment possible. The Eridu Genesis tells us that Sippar, the fourth city, was given to the gallant Utu, to the sun god himself. The Sumerian king list says that one king ruled there, Enmendu-Ana, sometimes written as Enmeduranki, whose name means chief of the powers of Dur-Anki, the meeting place of heaven and earth. He ruled for 7,200 years, though some versions give him different spans. And here's what's remarkable about this king. He wasn't just a ruler, he was a priest. Later Babylonian texts describe Enmeduranki as the founder of the Guild of Diviners, the Baru priests who read omens and interpreted the will of the gods. The gods themselves, the texts say, revealed to him the secrets of heaven and earth. They showed him how to read the liver of sacrificed animals, how to pour oil on water and interpret the patterns, how to observe the stars and understand their messages. He was taken up into the divine council, admitted to the assembly of the gods, and given knowledge that no other mortal possessed. This description has led many scholars to identify Enmeduranki with the biblical Enoch, the seventh patriarch before the flood, who walked with God and was taken up to heaven without experiencing death. The parallels are striking. Both were seventh in their respective genealogies. Both were associated with divine knowledge and heavenly ascent. Both lived before the great flood that reset the world. But let's focus on what this means for Sippar. This was a city of knowledge, but a different kind than Eridu's practical wisdom. This was esoteric knowledge, hidden knowledge, the secrets of divination and prophecy, the ability to see what's coming, to read the signs, to understand the will of the gods. In a very real sense, Sippar was the city of the future, the place where the divine plan was revealed to those who had the eyes to see it. The archaeological record shows that Sippar was occupied from very early times, with pottery finds dating back to the Uruk period. It grew substantially during the early dynastic period and remained continuously important through the Old Babylonian period and beyond. Unlike Eridu, which lost its political power but retained its religious prestige, Sippar maintained both. It was a major economic centre, the production heart of the wool industry. The finest Old Babylonian cylinder seals came from Sippar's workshops. This was a wealthy city, a powerful city, a city that could afford to maintain its massive temple complex and support its priestly scholars. The Babbara temple complex was repeatedly rebuilt by various rulers throughout Mesopotamian history. Samsu-Iluna of Babylon restored it in the 18th year of his reign. Neo-Babylonian rulers like Nebuchadnezzar II and Nabonidus also rebuilt it in later centuries. The continuity is remarkable. For thousands of years, from the antediluvian period through to the Persian conquest and beyond, Sippar remained the premier centre of sun worship and divination in Mesopotamia. There's a curious detail preserved by the ancient writer Berossus. He claimed that the antediluvian king of Sippar, whom he calls Xisuthros, buried the records of the prediluvian world at Sippar before the flood came. These records, Berossus says, contained all the gesto knowledge of the ancient world, all the wisdom of the ages before the catastrophe. Sippar's very name was supposedly connected with Sipru, the Akkadian word for writing or document. It was the city of records, the library of heaven, the place where knowledge was preserved against the coming destruction. This brings us to a profound question. If the gods knew the flood was coming, if they had the foresight granted by their divine nature or their advanced technology, wouldn't they take steps to preserve what mattered? Wouldn't they create repositories of knowledge, archives that could survive the deluge? And wouldn't one of those archives be in Sippar, the city of the sun, the city where the future was read in omens and written in stars? That question leads us to the fifth and final city, the city where the flood would begin, Shuruppac. The name alone carries weight. Shuruppac, located at modern Tel Farah, about halfway between modern Baghdad and the ancient city of Ur. The city measures roughly 1 kilometre from north to south, covering about 120 hectares at its height. German archaeologists first excavated it in 1902 and 1903, followed by a joint American expedition in 1931. What they found was extraordinary and disturbing. The Eridu Genesis tells us that Shuruppac, the fifth city, was given to Sud, a grain goddess who is also identified with Ninlil, the wife of the air god Enlil. This was a city of agriculture, of food production, of the basic sustenance that makes civilization possible. But Shuruppac is known for something else, something that would define it forever in human memory. This was the city of Ziusudra, the Sumerian Noah. The Sumerian king list tells us that the last king, before the flood, was Ubaratutu, who ruled from Shuruppac for 18,600 years, according to the standard Well-Blundell version, though different manuscript traditions preserve varying numbers. The texts indicate he had a son. That son's name was Ziusudra, which translates to something like life of long days or he found life. In later Akkadian texts, this figure is called Utnapishtim. In the biblical tradition, he appears as Noah. Whether these represent the same historical individual or the convergence of similar flood traditions across cultures remains debated among scholars, but they certainly preserve strikingly parallel narratives of deluge and survival. The Eridu Genesis, fragmentary though it is, tells the story. The text begins by describing the creation of humanity and the founding of the 5 cities. Then there's a large gap in the tablet, and when it resumes, it's in the middle of a crisis. The gods have decided to send a flood to destroy mankind. We don't know why. That section of the tablet is lost. But the god Enki, true to his nature as humanity's protector, decides to save at least some of his creation. Enki goes to Ziusudra's house in Shuruppac, but he can't directly warn the king because he's sworn an oath to the other gods to keep the plan secret. So he does something clever. He stands next to a reed wall and speaks as if talking to the wall itself, knowing that Ziusudra is on the other side listening. Reed wall, Enki says. Tear down your house and build a boat. Abandon your possessions and seek life. Reject worldly goods and keep your soul alive. Take aboard the boat the seed of all living things. Ziusudra understands. He builds a massive vessel and fills it with his family and with representatives of every animal species. The flood comes. For 7 days and 7 nights the storm rages. The text says the huge boat was tossed about on the great waters. Even the gods were terrified by what they'd unleashed. They cowered in the highest heaven, watching the world below drown. When the flood finally subsided, Ziusudra opened a window of the boat. The sun god Utu appeared, and Ziusudra prostrated himself and made offerings of oxen and sheep. The gods, who had been without offerings for a week, gathered around the smoke like flies. They were hungry. They needed humanity after all. An and Enlil, the supreme gods, gave Ziusudra and his wife a reward for preserving life. They granted them breath eternal and took them to live at the edge of the world in a distant paradise never to die. The flood hero had become immortal. Now here's where mythology meets archaeology in the most unsettling way. The 1931 excavations at Tel Farah found something that made everyone pause. A distinct layer of flood deposits separating 2 occupation levels. The flood layer sits right at the end of the Jemdet-Nasr period, dated to around 2,900 years before the Common Era. Below this layer is polychrome pottery from the Jemdet-Nasr period. Above it, the early dynastic period begins. Eric Schmidt, who directed those excavations, wrote something remarkable in his report. He said that the flood story of the Bible seems to be based on very real events, as suggested by the existence of inundation deposits at Ur, at Kish, and now at Farah, all accumulated on top of human habitation. These aren't metaphorical floods. These are actual sediment layers, water-laid silt and clay deposited by massive flooding events. The layer at Shuruppac isn't global, it's regional, covering southern Mesopotamia. But for the people living there, for the Sumerians whose entire world was that river valley, it would have been total. Their whole world drowned, everything they knew was washed away, and the king who survived, who preserved the seed of life, became the hero of the greatest story ever told. What makes this even more haunting is the Instructions of Shuruppac, another ancient text. It's a wisdom composition, a father giving advice to his son. Shuruppac gave instructions to his son, it begins. Shuruppac, the son of Ubaratutu, gave instructions to his son Ziusudra. The text creates an intriguing genealogical puzzle, as here Shuruppac appears as both a person and a city name, positioned as the son of Ubaratutu and father of Ziusudra. This may reflect the ancient practice of naming individuals after their cities, or it could indicate textual confusion between personal names and place names. The composition then lists dozens of practical rules for living a good life. Don't steal, don't murder, don't bear false witness, respect your mother, don't speak lies. This text, written in Sumerian, dates back to around 2,600 years before the Common Era, making it one of the oldest pieces of wisdom literature in human history. And it explicitly connects Shuruppac the city, Ubaratutu the king, and Ziusudra the flood hero. These weren't abstractions to the ancient Sumerians. These were their ancestors, their history, their foundation story. So we have 5 cities: Eridu, the city of wisdom and the deep waters, given to Enki; Bad Tibira, the city of metalworking and craft, given to Dumuzi and Inanna; Larak, the city of healing and judgment, given to Pabilsag; Sippar, the city of light and divination, given to Utu; and Shuruppac, the city of grain and survival, given to Sud. Each city served a function. Each represented an essential aspect of civilization. Wisdom, technology, health, knowledge, sustenance, the 5 pillars upon which everything else would be built. And each was ruled by a king who reigned for impossible lengths of time, who bridged the gap between the divine and the mortal, who carried out the plan that the Anunnaki, the assembly of the gods, had decreed. Why these 5 cities specifically? Why this sequence? The pattern is fascinating if you look at it as a progression. Eridu established the foundation, the core principles, the basic wisdom needed for civilization. Bad Tibira developed technology, turning raw materials into tools and transforming human capability. Larak provided healing and judgment, the moral and physical maintenance that keeps a society functional. Sippar offered foresight and divine communication, the ability to plan and understand cosmic patterns. And Shuruppac brought it all together with the basic necessity of feeding people, of sustaining life, of ensuring the continuation of the species. Together, these 5 cities created a complete system, not just a civilization, but the template for all civilizations, the blueprint that would be followed, unconsciously perhaps, by every culture that came after. Knowledge, technology, healing, foresight, and sustenance. Remove any one of these and the system collapses. But there's another layer to this. Each city was given to a specific god, but we might also consider a different interpretive framework. If we set aside the traditional religious reading for a moment and examine these cities as functional units, an intriguing pattern emerges. One could view them almost as specialized centers, each focused on developing a different aspect of what we might call the civilizational toolkit. From this perspective, Enki and Eridu could be seen as representing the establishment of fundamental knowledge transmission, the development of language, writing, and abstract thought. Dumuzi and Inanna in Bad Tibira would embody technological innovation, the transformation of raw materials into tools and manufactured goods. Pabilsag in Larak might represent the medical and judicial functions necessary to maintain social order and physical health. Utu in Sippar could symbolize the higher knowledge systems, astronomy, divination, and calendar keeping. And Sud in Shuruppac would ensure the agricultural foundation that makes everything else sustainable. This interpretation reframes the narrative from divine caprice to methodical organization. Whether this reflects actual planning by human administrators working across multiple city-states, or preserves memory of how early urbanization naturally specialized, or indeed represents something more extraordinary, depends on which framework you find most compelling. What's undeniable is the functional completeness of the system the myths describe. And then something went wrong, or perhaps something went right depending on your perspective. Humans multiplied too successfully. The noise they made, their prayers, their celebrations, their conflicts, all of it disturbed the gods. Specifically, it disturbed Enlil, the commander, the one who valued order and quiet above all else. He looked at these 5 cities, these 5 thriving centers of human activity, and decided the experiment had gotten out of hand. The flood wasn't random, it was a reset, a way to wipe the board clean and start again with a smaller, more manageable population. But Enki couldn't let all his work be destroyed. He'd spent too long teaching humans, raising them, caring for them. So he saved a remnant, just enough to preserve what had been learned, to carry the knowledge forward into the new world that would emerge from the waters. The 5 cities drowned, their inhabitants perished, but the pattern they'd established survived. When the waters receded and humanity began rebuilding, they built new cities: Kish, Uruk, and many others. But these new cities followed the model. They had temples for wisdom, workshops for crafts, physicians for healing, priests for divination, granaries for food storage. The template remained. Some researchers have suggested that the similar flood layers found at different Mesopotamian sites, all dating to roughly the same period around 2,900 years before the Common Era, indicate a real catastrophic event. Not a global flood that covered the entire Earth, but a massive regional inundation that destroyed the early Sumerian civilization. River avulsions, seasonal flooding, the unpredictable behaviour of the Tigris and Euphrates all contributed to making southern Mesopotamia a dangerous place to live. Cities could be swept away in a matter of days. But the memory of the 5 antediluvian cities persisted. They were written about, mourned over, referenced in countless texts for thousands of years afterward. Long after the physical cities were abandoned and forgotten, their names carried power. To say you were performing a ritual as it was done in Eridu was to claim ultimate authority and authenticity. To invoke the metalworkers of Bad Tibira was to call upon ancient mastery. To pray at a temple built in the style of Larak was to connect with primordial healing power. The 5 cities became mythological touchstones, reference points for perfection and loss. Like Eden in the biblical tradition, they represented a time before the fall, before the catastrophe, before the world became complicated and difficult. A golden age when gods walked among humans, when kings reigned for eons, when knowledge flowed directly from heaven to earth. Modern occult traditions have seized on these 5 cities as well. Some theorize that the sites themselves hold residual energy, that the original temples, even in ruins, even buried under meters of earth and sand, still function as anchors for divine power. Ceremonial magicians have attempted to recreate the rituals of the Iabzu, to call upon Enki using formulae supposedly preserved from before the flood. Archaeological evidence is repurposed as magical instruction, cylinder seals interpreted as talismans, administrative texts read as incantations. Whether there's any truth to these practices is impossible to say. But what's undeniable is the psychological power of the 5 cities. They represent something humanity has lost and cannot regain. A direct connection to the divine. A time when the gods were present, visible, accessible. A time when the boundary between heaven and earth was permeable. When kingship literally descended from above. The Sumerian king list emphasizes this phrase repeatedly. When kingship descended from heaven. When the flood swept over. When kingship descended from heaven again. There's a rhythm to it. A pattern of divine intervention, human development, catastrophe and renewal. The 5 cities were the first iteration, the original model. Everything since has been an attempt to recreate what was lost. What's particularly striking is how the 5 cities distribute different aspects of civilization. This wasn't random. Eridu couldn't have been a city of metalworking. It was too early, located in the marshes where metal ore wasn't available. It had to be the city of wisdom, of basic principles. Bad Tibira came second because you need wisdom before you can develop technology. Larak followed because technology creates problems that need healing and judgment to resolve. Sippar came fourth because only with a stable, healthy society can you develop the leisure and resources for astronomy and divination. And Shuruppac came last because sustenance, agriculture, the ability to feed large populations, that's what allows everything else to scale up. The sequence is logical, almost inevitable. It's exactly how you'd build a civilization from scratch if you were starting from zero. First principles, then tools, then maintenance, then knowledge systems, then resource production. The Anunnaki, whether they were gods or advanced beings or personifications of natural forces, followed a rational developmental plan. This raises an uncomfortable question. If the 5 cities represent such a perfect progression, such a well-designed system, why did it fail? Why did the gods decide to destroy their own creation? The texts hint at different reasons. The noise, human wickedness, overpopulation. But none of these explanations feel complete. The gods created humans to be workers, to be numerous, to till the fields and maintain the irrigation canals. If humans were doing exactly what they were designed to do, why punish them for it? One possibility, explored by some interpreters of these myths, is that the flood wasn't a punishment at all, but represented a cyclical reset. In complex systems, there sometimes comes a need to simplify variables and begin again with refined parameters. By this reading, the preservation of certain individuals like Zusudra might reflect not divine favoritism based on righteousness, but the selection of those who best embodied the intended characteristics. The texts themselves emphasize Zusudra's piety and wisdom, qualities that align with what Enki, as god of wisdom, would value most highly. This represents just one way of interpreting the mythological framework. It suggests that humanity's survival through the flood might have involved careful selection rather than random chance. Whether this reflects an actual historical winnowing of human populations, or serves as a mythological explanation for why certain cultural traditions survived while others vanished, remains an open question. This interpretation, while speculative, raises thought-provoking questions about cultural continuity and historical memory. It suggests that the civilizations we know emerged from a relatively narrow cultural bottleneck, preserving specific traditions and knowledge, while others were lost. Whether this bottleneck was caused by an actual catastrophic flood, by the natural rise and fall of early settlements, or by the selective memory of mythmakers, the result is similar. We inherit from a specific lineage of cultural development, not from all the paths early humanity might have explored. The 5 cities in this reading weren't just the first cities. They were the template setters, the foundational models whose influence shaped everything that followed. Subsequent Mesopotamian civilization essentially elaborated on themes established in those original 5 centers. We can observe this in the archaeological and textual record. Later cities referenced Eridu's wisdom traditions, imitated Bad Tibira's craft specializations, maintained Larak's healing practices, continued Sippar's astronomical observations, and relied on agricultural systems refined over millennia. Nothing truly new has been added. We've refined the 5 pillars. We've built higher on the foundation. But the foundation itself, that came from before the flood, from the antediluvian cities, from the time when gods walked the earth and kings reigned for thousands of years. There's a melancholy to this realization. It suggests that human civilization peaked at its very beginning, that we've spent the last 5,000 years simply trying to recover what was lost. The Sumerians themselves seem to have believed this. They looked back to the 5 cities with a kind of desperate nostalgia, always trying to live up to the standards set by Alulim and Dumuzi, and Ensipadsid-Anna, always falling short, always aware that they were living in a diminished age. Every king who came after the flood was measured against those impossible reigns of tens of thousands of years. Every temple was compared to the original Iabzu. Every priest was a pale shadow of Enmeduranki. The whole of Mesopotamian civilization was haunted by what it had lost. And yet, paradoxically, this loss might have been the gift. Because the 5 cities, perfect as they were static. They were completed systems, fully formed, handed down from above. There was nothing for humans to discover, nothing to invent, nothing to create. They simply received and obeyed. After the flood, that changed. The gods withdrew. Oh, they were still worshipped, still invoked, still believed to intervene occasionally. But they no longer walked the streets. They no longer ruled directly. Humans had to figure things out for themselves. And in that figuring out, in that struggle to remember and reconstruct what had been lost, something new emerged. Human agency, human creativity, the painful, glorious burden of making our own choices and living with the consequences. The 5 cities gave us the template. The flood forced us to use it. And everything that's happened since, all of human history, all of human achievement, has been the working out of that tension. The pattern given from above meets the freedom earned through catastrophe. The divine plan encounters human improvisation. And perhaps that was the real purpose all along. Perhaps the 5 cities were never meant to last forever. They were the seed planted in good soil, watered with divine wisdom, protected and nurtured, until they were strong enough to survive. And then the flood came, not as punishment, but as harvest. The seed broken open, scattered across the land, taking root in 1,000 new places, growing into forms the original gardeners never imagined. The 5 cities endure, not as physical places, though archaeologists continue to excavate their ruins, continue to piece together their stories from broken tablets and crumbling walls. They endure as ideas, as principles, as the deep structure underlying everything we build. Every library is Eridu. Every factory is Bad Tibira. Every hospital is Larak. Every observatory is Sippar. Every farm is Shuruppac. We're still living in those 5 cities. We never left. The flood washed away the buildings, but not the blueprint. And so we build again, and again, and again, following patterns we barely understand, recreating structures whose original purpose has been forgotten, animated by a memory we can't quite access but can't escape either. The Sumerian king list ends its antediluvian section with a simple, devastating phrase. Then the flood swept over. Everything before that line is mythology. Everything after is history. But the line itself is porous. Mythology bleeds into history. History remembers mythology. And in the space between them, in that liminal zone where gods and humans met, where kingship descended from heaven and cities rose from the marshes, That's where the 5 cities exist. Forever before, forever foundational, forever lost, and forever present. As you lie here in the darkness, as your breathing slows and your thoughts begin to drift, you can almost imagine yourself there, standing in the reed marshes outside Eridu, watching the priests carry offerings to the Iabzu, walking the streets of Bad Tibira as metalworkers pound bronze into tools, seeking healing in Larak's quiet temples, gazing up at the stars from Sippar's observatories, breaking bread in Shuruppac's fields, not knowing that the rain beginning to fall will never stop. The 5 cities are calling to you across the millennia, not with words but with patterns. The pattern of wisdom, technology, healing, foresight and sustenance. The pattern that built them. The pattern that builds everything. Listen closely and you can hear it. A rhythm beneath the rhythm of your breath. A structure underlying the structure of your thoughts. After kingship descended from heaven, after the cities were established, after the gods walked the earth and taught humanity everything they know, after all of that the flood swept over. But the pattern remained, and it remains still, in you, in all of us. The descendants of Zeus Sudra, carrying forward the gift and the burden of the 5 cities, building again what was washed away, reaching again toward heaven, knowing that somewhere in our deep past, in the time before time, kingship was given to us as a sacred trust. The 5 cities stand in the space between sleeping and waking, between myth and history, between the divine and the human, and they whisper the same thing they've been whispering for 5,000 years. Remember. Build, preserve, because another flood is always coming, whether of water or fire or forgetting. And when it does, the pattern must survive. The 5 pillars must endure, so that after the flood sweeps over, after kingship descends from heaven once more, the cities can rise again. The question that haunts us, that perhaps should haunt us more than it does, is whether any of this is literally true. Did 5 specific cities exist in the exact sequence described? Did gods actually choose them, assign them purposes, rule over them? Or is this mythology pure and simple, a beautiful story that ancient people told to make sense of their world? The archaeological evidence presents a complex picture. Eridu is real, verifiably ancient, founded around 5,400 years before the Common Era. Its temple to Enki was rebuilt continuously for thousands of years. This isn't speculation. You can visit the ruins today at Tel Abu Shahrain. You can see the layers of occupation, count the temple levels, hold the inscribed bricks in your hands. Bad Tibira appears to be Tel al-Medina. The evidence is strong but not definitive, based on those looted foundation cones and the geographic description in ancient texts. The site shows the right period of occupation, evidence of metalworking, signs of catastrophic fire. But no large-scale excavation has been completed there, no comprehensive survey that would allow us to say with absolute certainty, yes, this is Bad Tibira. Larak remains completely unidentified. It might be Tel al-Wilaya. It might be Tel al-Hayad. It might be a site we haven't excavated yet, or one that's been completely eroded away by the shifting rivers and relentless wind. We know Larak existed because multiple ancient texts mention it, texts from different periods written by different scribes, but we can't put a pin in a map and say, there, that's where it stood. Sippar is unquestionably Tel Abu Haba. The identification is secure. Tens of thousands of tablets confirm it. The site is massive, over 1 square kilometre, with clear evidence of occupation from the Uruk period through the Persian conquest. The Ibab Bara temple is there, rebuilt multiple times exactly as the texts describe. Sippar is real in a way that allows no doubt. Shuruppac is Tel Farah. Again, the identification is secure based on tablets found at the site that name it explicitly. The flood layer is real. You can see it in the archaeological sections. Water-laid sediments interrupting the occupation sequence right at the end of the Jemdet-Nazir period. This isn't mythology. It's stratigraphy, measurable, datable, physical evidence of catastrophic flooding. So 4 of the 5 cities can be archaeologically confirmed or strongly suspected. 4 cities that really existed, that really were occupied in the periods the king list suggests, that really did experience some kind of catastrophic event around 2,900 years before the Common Era. Only Larak remains elusive, and even there, the written evidence is consistent and detailed enough that most scholars believe it existed somewhere. We just haven't found it yet. But here's where it gets complicated. Just because the cities existed doesn't mean the mythological framework surrounding them is true. Just because there were real settlements called Eridu and Sippar doesn't prove that gods assigned them to Enki and Utu, or that impossible long-lived kings ruled them for tens of thousands of years. Mainstream scholarship interprets the Sumerian king list as a political document, a piece of propaganda designed to legitimize royal authority by connecting contemporary rulers to an unbroken chain stretching back to the beginning of time. The fantastic numbers aren't meant literally. They are symbolic, representing great antiquity, divine favour, or possibly just copying errors and misunderstandings as the lists were transmitted through generations of scribes. The flood in this view was a real regional catastrophe, possibly multiple floods that were conflated in cultural memory into a single event. Real enough to leave physical evidence, traumatic enough to become the defining moment in Mesopotamian history. But not a divine punishment, just the predictable, if devastating, consequence of living on a floodplain between two unpredictable rivers. The gods themselves are understood as personifications of natural forces and social structures. Enki represents water and wisdom because water brings life, and because irrigation requires sophisticated engineering knowledge. Dumuzi represents the agricultural cycle of death and rebirth. Pabilsag represents the constellation Sagittarius and the medicinal plants associated with that time of year. Utu is literally the sun, the most obvious and powerful force in the sky. Sud is grain, the foundation of settled agricultural life. This interpretation is rigorous, evidence-based, intellectually defensible. It acknowledges the mythology while grounding it in material reality. It doesn't require us to believe impossible things. It preserves the cultural and historical value of these texts, while recognizing them as products of human imagination rather than divine revelation. And yet there's something that doesn't quite fit in this tidy explanation. Something that whispers at the edges of our certainty. Why would the Sumerians, practical people by all accounts, excellent engineers and administrators, why would they preserve such specific numerical details if they were purely symbolic? The king list doesn't just say, a very long time ago. It says 28,800 years. It says 36,000 years. It says 108,000 years for the three kings of Bad Tibira combined. These aren't round numbers. They're not obvious multiples. They're precise, detailed, consistent across multiple manuscript traditions. And why these 5 cities specifically? If you're inventing a mythology to legitimize your rule, why not include your own city in the antediluvian period? Why make Eridu first when you're ruling from Uruk or Ur? The cities in the king list aren't necessarily the most politically important cities at the time the list was compiled. They're genuinely old, sites archaeologically verified as among the earliest urban settlements in Mesopotamia. Whoever compiled the list had access to real historical information about settlement patterns. The sequence of the cities also shows a geographical and cultural logic that's hard to explain as pure invention. Eridu in the far south, closest to the Persian Gulf. Bad Tibra, Larak and Sippar, forming a rough line moving northeast. Shuruppac as a kind of central anchor point. This distribution makes sense if you're describing the actual spread of early urban culture across southern Mesopotamia. It makes less sense if you're just making up a story. And then there's the flood evidence itself, not just at Shuruppac but at multiple sites. Ur has a flood layer. Kish has flood layers. Uruk shows evidence of flooding. These aren't all the same flood, the sediments date to slightly different periods, but there's a cluster of catastrophic flooding events in southern Mesopotamia right around the turn of the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, exactly when the antediluvian period supposedly ended. What if the Sumerian king list is doing something more sophisticated than simply inventing mythology or recording literal history? What if it's encoding both? What if it's preserving genuine historical memory about real cities and real events, but expressing that memory through a framework that, to us, looks mythological? Consider what information needs to be preserved. The earliest human settlements, the development of key technologies, the establishment of religious and political structures, the memory of catastrophic flooding. All of this is historically important, worth remembering and transmitting to future generations. But in a pre-literate or barely literate society, how do you preserve such information across centuries or millennia? You encode it in story, you make it memorable, you attach it to dramatic narratives about gods and heroes and impossible feats. You create a framework that's easy to remember, easy to recite, easy to pass down. The fantastic numbers aren't random, they're mnemonic devices. markers that make the information stick in memory. The impossibly long reigns might encode information about how long each city was culturally dominant, or how many generations a particular cultural phase lasted. If a year in the antediluvian section means something different than a solar year, if it represents a season or a generation or some other period, then suddenly the numbers become more manageable. Alulim's 28,800 years might represent 800 actual years, or 80 generations, or some other calculable period. Or consider this possibility. What if the numbers are accurate, but they're not measuring time the way we think? What if they're measuring something else entirely? Population, economic output, construction cycles, the number of workers required to build the temples? We assume years means solar revolutions, but the Sumerian term sar actually means perfect circle or completed cycle. It might not be temporal at all. The gods present a similar puzzle. If we strip away the supernatural elements and look at their functions, they map remarkably well onto actual social roles and institutions. Enkia's wisdom and water management describes perfectly what a chief engineer or hydraulic administrator would do. Someone who understood irrigation, who knew how to read the river, who could predict flooding and direct water to fields. Such a person would have seemed godlike to people dependent on their expertise. Dumazi, as the dying and rising god of agriculture and shepherding, describes the actual cycle of planting and harvest, but it might also preserve memory of actual priest-kings who performed ritual dramas representing that cycle. In many ancient cultures, the king was required to perform a sacred marriage ceremony, literally or symbolically coupling with a priestess representing the earth, goddess, to ensure fertility of the land. This wasn't metaphor to them. It was technology, sacred technology perhaps, but technology nonetheless. Pabel Saga's healer and judge describes the role of a chief physician or magistrate, someone who tended to the health of the community, both physical and social. The constellation association might indicate that this person also served as an astronomer or timekeeper, roles often connected to healing in ancient cultures because both required precise observation and deep knowledge. Utua's sun and justice isn't random. In agricultural societies, the sun's movement determines the calendar, the planting schedule, the entire rhythm of life. Understanding the sun's path, being able to predict solstices and equinoxes, that's a form of power. And that astronomical knowledge was closely tied to the administration of justice because legal proceedings often occurred at specific times of day, required accurate timekeeping, needed impartial observation. Suda's grain goddess is perhaps the most straightforward. Grain is civilization, the surplus food that allows specialists to exist, allows cities to grow, allows culture to develop. Control of the grain supply is control of everything. The person or institution that manages food distribution literally controls life and death. If we understand the gods as titles or roles rather than as supernatural beings, if we see them as preserved memories of real individuals or real institutions, then the mythology takes on a different character. It becomes a record of how early civilization was organized, who had power, how different functions were distributed across different centers. In this reading, the 5 cities weren't chosen by gods. They were chosen by whoever was actually orchestrating the development of Mesopotamian civilization, possibly a central authority, possibly just the emergent logic of geography and resources and cultural evolution. Each city specialized in a particular function, because specialization creates efficiency. Division of labor works for cities as well as for individuals. Eridu specialized in religious authority and knowledge preservation. Bad Tibira in metallurgy and craft production. Larak in medicine and law. Sippar in astronomy and divination. Shuruppac in agriculture and food production. Together they formed a network, an interconnected system that could support a growing population and an increasingly complex culture. The flood that destroyed this system wasn't punishment from angry gods. It was the inherent fragility of building cities on a floodplain. Eventually, catastrophically, the system failed. The rivers shifted course, the floods came, the carefully balanced network fell apart, but the memory persisted. The pattern persisted. And when people rebuilt, they followed the same template because the template was sound, because it worked, because it was the only model they knew. This interpretation feels almost reasonable, almost scientific. It preserves the historical core while discarding the supernatural shell. It allows us to learn from the past without requiring us to believe in gods walking the earth. But it leaves something out. It leaves out the persistent, nagging sense that we're missing something important, that there's a layer of meaning we can't access because we're looking at it from the wrong angle, asking the wrong questions, assuming we already know what's possible and what isn't. The ancient Sumerians were not stupid. They were phenomenally intelligent, sophisticated, capable of mathematical and architectural achievements that still impress us today. They invented writing, developed advanced metallurgy, created complex legal codes, mapped the heavens with remarkable precision. These were not primitive people making up stories to explain thunder. When they wrote that kingship descended from heaven, maybe they meant something we can't quite grasp. When they recorded reigns lasting thousands of years, maybe they were preserving information in a format we haven't learned to decode. When they described gods walking among humans, maybe they were witnessing something real that doesn't fit into our categories of natural and supernatural, real and mythological. The universe is stranger than we often admit. Quantum mechanics reveals that particles can exist in multiple states simultaneously, that observation affects reality, that causation can run backwards in time. Relativity shows us that time dilates, that space curves, that what seems solid and fixed is actually fluid and relative. Archaeology keeps finding evidence that pushes back the dates of human civilization, that reveals sophistication where we expected primitivism, that forces us to revise our understanding of what ancient people knew and could do. What if the 5 cities are strange in a way we're not equipped to understand yet? What if they represent something that looks like mythology from our vantage point but was something else entirely to the people who built them? What if the Sumerian king list is absolutely accurate and we're the ones who are confused about what it's actually recording? This isn't an argument for ancient aliens or supernatural intervention. It's an argument for humility, for recognizing the limits of our understanding, for staying open to possibilities we haven't imagined. The 5 cities existed, that's fact. They were ancient, important, connected to each other in some deliberate way. Also fact. Something catastrophic happened to them around the turn of the 3rd millennium. Again, fact. Everything else, the gods, the impossible reigns, the divine plan, the assignment of specific functions to specific cities, all of that exists in a space between fact and fiction, between history and mythology, between what we can prove and what we can only wonder about. And maybe that's appropriate. Maybe that's exactly where the 5 cities should exist. In the liminal space, the threshold, the place where certainty gives way to mystery. They're old enough that we can't fully know them, but recent enough that we can't completely dismiss them. They're mythological enough to fascinate us, but historical enough to ground us. They are specific enough to investigate, but mysterious enough to resist complete explanation. The 5 cities are a gift from the past, but a strange gift. Not a clear answer, but a provocative question. Not a completed puzzle, but a set of pieces that don't quite fit together in any obvious way. They challenge us to think harder, to look more carefully, to consider possibilities we'd normally dismiss. And perhaps that's the real purpose they serve now, not to tell us what definitely happened in the deep past, but to remind us that the deep past is deeper than we think, stranger than we imagine, full of patterns and possibilities we're only beginning to recognize. The archaeological work continues. New excavations are being planned for several of the sites. Ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry surveys have revealed structures at Shuruppac that haven't been excavated yet. The Iraqi government and international teams are working to protect and study these sites despite the political challenges. Every season brings new tablets, new inscriptions, new evidence that might help us understand. But even if we excavate every meter of every site, even if we recover every tablet and translate every word, we'll still be dealing with fragments. The full story, if there even is a full story, is lost. The complete archive that Berossus claimed was buried at Sippar, if it ever existed, hasn't been found. The original Sumerian king list, the first version from which all later copies descend, is lost. The oral traditions that preceded the written texts, the songs and stories that people told before anyone thought to press them into clay, those are gone forever. We're like archaeologists of the future trying to understand our own civilization from a handful of random survivals. Imagine trying to reconstruct 21st century culture from a few smartphones, a fast food menu, and some random social media posts. You'd get the basic outlines, but you'd miss the essence, the lived experience, the actual meaning of it all. The 5 cities are even more remote from us than that. We're separated not just by time, but by a complete civilizational collapse, multiple collapses actually, by the death of languages, by the transformation of landscape by fundamental shifts in how humans think and organize themselves. And yet they call to us. They persist in our imagination. They show up in our dreams and our art and our speculation. The pattern of the 5 cities, whether we consciously recognize it or not, continues to shape how we build, how we organize, how we think about the relationship between civilization and the divine. Every time we construct a center of learning, we're building Eridu. Every industrial center is Bad Tibira reborn. Every hospital and courthouse echoes Larak. Every observatory and research institution recalls Sippar. Every farm and food distribution system carries forward Shuruppac. The pattern persists because the pattern works, because it reflects something fundamental about how humans organize complex societies, because it was right the first time and we've been following the blueprint ever since. Maybe that's the real miracle. Not that gods walked the earth 5,000 years ago, but that human beings, working with mud and reeds and stone with nothing but their intelligence and determination, created something so enduring that it still shapes our world. Created 5 cities that would become the foundation of everything, that would survive flood and conquest and time itself to remain with us as pattern, as principle, as possibility. The 5 cities are our ancestors' gift to us. They're saying, look, this is how it's done. This is the pattern that works. Wisdom, technology, healing, foresight, sustenance. Build these 5 pillars and you can support everything else. Neglect any one of them and the whole structure collapses. We ignore this message at our peril. Modern civilization has magnificent technology, Bad Tibira beyond anything the ancient Sumerians could have imagined. But do we have equivalent wisdom, equivalent Eridu? Do we have adequate healing for all, adequate Larak? Do we truly seek foresight, truly honour Sippar's quest for understanding? Do we ensure everyone has sustenance, truly fulfill Shuruppac's mission? The pattern tells us all 5 are necessary. You can't have sustainable civilization with only technology. You need wisdom to guide it, healing to maintain it, foresight to navigate it, sustenance to fuel it. Remove any pillar and the whole edifice becomes unstable. But let's push deeper into what each city actually represented, because the surface meanings only scratch at something more profound. Each city wasn't just a place or a function. Each was a kind of sacred technology, a way of accessing and implementing divine principles in the material world. Eridu, the city of the Abzu, represents something essential about the nature of wisdom itself. The Abzu wasn't simply underground fresh water. In Sumerian cosmology, it was the primordial substance from which everything emerged. It was potential in its purest form, undifferentiated possibility waiting to be shaped into reality. When Enki dwelt in the Abzu, when his temple was built above it, this symbolized access to that primordial creative power. The myths tell us that Enki possessed all the me, all the fundamental patterns or principles of civilization. These weren't abstractions. The Sumerians conceived of them as actual objects, as tangible things that could be stored, transferred, stolen. In one story, Enki keeps the me in a vault in the Abzu, guarding them jealously. This suggests a kind of knowledge vault, a repository where the essential templates for civilization were preserved. Now, consider what this might actually mean in practical terms. If you're establishing the first civilization, you need to preserve crucial knowledge across generations, but you don't have libraries, you barely have writing, you certainly don't have any kind of permanent storage medium that won't decay. How do you ensure that essential information survives? You encode it in ritual. You build it into architecture. You embed it in songs and stories and ceremonial practices that will be repeated so often they become unforgettable. The temple at Eridu, with its succession of reconstructions, each built precisely on the same spot, each following the same essential design, becomes itself a kind of storage device. The building preserves the knowledge encoded in its proportions, its orientation, its fundamental structure. This is why Enki's temple was called the House of the Aquifer. It wasn't just built above freshwater springs. It was itself a wellspring, a source from which knowledge continuously flowed. The priests who served there weren't just performing empty rituals. They were accessing and maintaining a system of knowledge preservation, ensuring that the patterns established at the beginning would continue to be available. The fish bones around the altar, those carp that the priests offered to Enki, those might have been more than simple sacrifice. Fish are creatures of the water, of the Abzu. They navigate the depths where humans cannot go. They might represent the mysterious, ineffable knowledge that comes from those depths. knowledge that can't be captured in words or rules, but can only be experienced directly, tasted, consumed, integrated into oneself. Bad Tibira presents a different kind of mystery, the Wall of the Metalworkers. Why would metalworking be important enough to merit being the second city, the second pillar of civilization? Because metallurgy isn't just craft, it's transformation. It's the ability to take raw earth and fire and breath and time and combine them in precise ways to create something entirely new, something that didn't exist before. The development of metalworking represents a threshold in human consciousness. Before metallurgy, you worked with what nature provided directly. You shaped wood and stone and bone, but you didn't fundamentally transform them. With metallurgy, you become a creator, a transformer. You take disparate elements, subject them to precise processes, and produce something with properties none of the original materials possessed. This is alchemy in the original sense. Not the later medieval fantasy of turning lead into gold, but the real alchemical work of transformation. And it required knowledge that seemed almost magical. How did ancient metalworkers discover that certain rocks, when heated to specific temperatures and combined with specific other materials, would produce copper or bronze? How did they learn the precise ratios, the exact sequences of heating and cooling and hammering that would produce useful tools? The myths say Dumuzi ruled Bad Tibira. Dumuzi the shepherd, the dying and rising god, and this is significant. The shepherd is one who tends the flock, who guides and protects but also culls and selects. In the context of metallurgy, this might represent the careful selection of materials, the tending of the fire, the protection of the process, and, yes, the destruction of failed attempts, the scrapping of poor quality metal. Dumuzi's death and resurrection in the myths mirrors the cycle of metalworking. The ore dies when it's smelted, losing its original form. But from that death comes rebirth as purified metal. The metal dies again when it's worked and shaped, but is reborn as a useful tool. This isn't just poetic metaphor. It's a precise description of the metallurgical process encoded in mythological language. The coupling of Dumuzi and Inanna, that sacred marriage that features so prominently in Sumerian religion, it might represent the union of the male principle, fire, transformation, active force, with the female principle, earth, materials, receptive substance. From their union comes the birth of new forms, new possibilities. In Bad Tibira, this union produced literal children, tools, weapons, implements that would change the world. The destruction of Bad Tibira by fire, evidenced by those vitrified bricks, takes on a darker significance. What if something went wrong with the great work? What if the metallurgical processes being developed there proved too dangerous, produced something uncontrollable? The texts don't tell us why Bad Tibira was abandoned, only that kingship moved on. But the archaeological evidence of extreme heat, of bricks melted beyond anything a normal fire could produce, suggests a catastrophe related to the city's primary function. Larak, the lost city, the city of healing and judgment. Its disappearance from the archaeological record might not be accidental. Some knowledge is considered too dangerous to preserve openly. Some functions are deliberately obscured, hidden, protected from those who might misuse them. Pabilsag, the patron of Larak, was a complex deity, warrior and healer, judge and physician, connected to both life-giving medicine and death-bringing plague. In Sumerian thought, these weren't contradictions. Healing and harming were two aspects of the same knowledge, two sides of the same power. The physician knows which plants cure, but that means they also know which plants kill. The judge maintains order, but that means they also even have the power to destroy those who threaten it. Larak might have been where the dark sciences were studied. Not evil in any simple sense, but dangerous. The knowledge of poisons and antidotes, the understanding of plague and quarantine, the development of surgical techniques that involved cutting into living flesh, the administration of justice that sometimes required execution or exile. These were necessary functions, but they required careful control, required keeping them separate from the general populace, required a sacred space where such knowledge could be used but also contained. The association with Pabilsag as a constellation, as Sagittarius the Archer, is telling. An archer must judge distance, wind, trajectory, must calculate precisely to hit the target. One small error and the arrow misses, or worse, hits the wrong target. This precision, this calculation, this careful weighing of variables, this is what Larak represented. the city of careful measurement, of precise intervention, of calculated action. If Larak has truly vanished, if its location remains unknown despite extensive surveys, perhaps that was intentional. Perhaps the knowledge preserved there was deemed too dangerous to leave traces, too powerful to risk being rediscovered by those who lacked the wisdom to use it properly. The city of healing becomes a buried secret, a capability that civilization lost or chose to lose. Sippar shines in contrast. The city of light, of open knowledge, of divine revelation made public. The Ibabra, the shining house, where the sun god's light illuminated everything, left nothing hidden, made all things clear. This was knowledge meant to be shared, meant to be taught, meant to spread across the land. Enmeduranki, the seventh king, the one who was taken up into heaven and shown divine secrets, the founder of the Diviners Guild, the first human to learn how to read the future from the present, how to see the patterns that connect cause to effect across time. This represents a specific form of knowledge, predictive knowledge, the ability to model and forecast and plan. Divination in ancient Mesopotamia was serious business. This wasn't superstition or random guessing. The Baru priests developed sophisticated pattern recognition systems, elaborate taxonomies of omens and portents. They kept detailed records of events and their antecedents, building up an empirical database they could query for guidance. If the liver of a sacrificed sheep showed certain characteristics on the day before a successful military campaign, then the next time those characteristics appeared, a military campaign might be advised. Modern scientists sometimes mock this as primitive magical thinking, but it's actually proto-statistical analysis, an early attempt to find correlations and build predictive models. The methodology was flawed from our perspective, yes, but the underlying logic was sound. Observe, record, look for patterns, make predictions based on patterns, adjust your model based on outcomes. Sippar was where this methodology was developed and refined. The accumulated wisdom of Eridu provided the foundation. The transformative technology of Bad Tibira provided the tools to record observations. The healing knowledge of Larak provided the anatomical understanding necessary for liver divination. And at Sippar, all of this came together into a systematic approach to understanding and predicting the future. The sun's predictable daily journey across the sky provided the model. If the sun follows fixed patterns, if the seasons return in regular cycles, if the stars wheel through the heavens in orderly procession, then perhaps everything follows patterns. Perhaps nothing is truly random. Perhaps with enough observation, enough careful attention, any pattern can be discerned and any future predicted. This is still the assumption underlying all modern science, that the universe is lawful, that patterns exist, that knowledge is possible. Sippar was where this assumption was first systematically applied to the problem of understanding reality. The burial of antediluvian records at Sippar, that claim by Berossus, makes sense in this context. If you know a catastrophe is coming, if you can read the omens and see the flood approaching, what do? You preserve what matters most. You create a time capsule, bury it in the one place most associated with foresight and knowledge, and hope that future generations will find it and learn from it. Whether such a cache actually exists, whether it's still buried beneath Tel Abu Habar waiting to be discovered, is an open question. But the story itself is valuable. It tells us that the ancient Mesopotamians understood the importance of preserving knowledge across catastrophic disruptions. They thought about information security, about how to protect crucial data against loss, about how to communicate with a future that might not remember the past. And then Shuruppac, the fifth city, the last city, the city of grain and sustenance and ultimately survival. The city of Zeus Sudra, the flood hero, the man who preserved life through the deluge. Shuruppac's function seems obvious, perhaps too obvious. Food production, agriculture, the basic work of feeding people. But there's a deeper layer here. Shuruppac wasn't just about growing grain. It was about sustainability, about ensuring that civilization could continue, about planning for the long term. The instructions of Shuruppac, that wisdom text where the king advises his son, is not primarily about agriculture. It's about right living, about moral behavior, about the habits and practices that allow communities to thrive across generations. Don't lie, don't steal, honor your parents, be kind to widows, help the poor. These aren't just nice sentiments, they are practical advice for maintaining social cohesion, for ensuring that the community survives. Because that's what Shuruppac ultimately represents. Not just physical sustenance, but social and ethical sustenance. The moral and behavioural patterns that allow human beings to live together in large numbers without destroying each other. The wisdom that says you can't eat today's seed grain no matter how hungry you are, because you need it for next year's crop. The foresight that says you must help your neighbour in their time of need, because next time it might be you who needs help. Zeusudra, the man who builds the ark, who saves the seed of all living things, he's not just saving biological diversity, he's saving cultural information, social practices, accumulated wisdom. He's ensuring that after the flood, after the catastrophic reset, humanity doesn't have to start from zero, doesn't have to rediscover everything through painful trial and error. The Ark is itself a kind of city, a mobile Shuruppac that carries the pattern forward through the disaster. And when the waters recede, when Zeusudra and his family emerge, they don't scatter randomly across the land. They rebuild according to the pattern, recreating the 5 cities' functions even if not their exact locations. Because the patterns is what Marban matters, the pattern is what saves them. The flood layer found at Shuruppac, that physical evidence of catastrophe, it validates the core story even if the details remain mythological. Something happened. The waters rose, cities drowned, people died, and someone, somehow, preserved enough to allow civilization to continue. This brings us to the final, deepest mystery of the 5 cities. Why did the pattern survive the flood when the cities themselves didn't? How did knowledge of the 5-fold structure persist, even after the physical manifestations were destroyed? One answer might be that the pattern was never just about physical cities. It was always about principles, about functions, about the essential components of civilization. The cities were the first implementation, the proof of concept, but they were never meant to be the only implementation. Think of it this way. If you're designing a civilization from scratch, if you're the Anunnaki or whoever actually planned this system, you don't want it to be fragile. You don't want a single point of failure. You don't want the whole thing to collapse if one city is destroyed. So you distribute the functions. You create redundancy. You encode the pattern in multiple ways, in physical structures, in ritual practices, in written texts, in oral traditions, in the very layout of the irrigation canals and field systems. You make the pattern so fundamental, so deeply embedded, that it becomes almost impossible to erase completely. And you teach the pattern not just to the cities, but to the people. Every household becomes a microcosm of the 5 cities. The hearth is Eridu, the place of family wisdom. The workshop or tool storage is Bad Tibira, the place of craft. The place where you tend your sick or settle disputes is Larak. The place where you observe the sky and plan your work is Sippar. The storeroom where you keep your grain and supplies is Shuruppac. This way, even if every city is destroyed, even if every temple collapses, even if every priest is killed and every tablet is broken, the pattern survives, because it's built into the structure of human life itself, into the basic necessities of existence. You can't have human civilization without wisdom, technology, healing, foresight, and sustenance. The 5 cities didn't invent these needs. They organized them, named them, gave them form. But the needs themselves are eternal. This is what makes the 5 cities immortal. They exist now not as ruins in Iraq, but as patterns in consciousness, as archetypal forms that shape how we think about civilization. When we plan a new settlement, we might not consciously invoke Eridu or Bad Tibira, but we still ask the same questions. Where will knowledge be centered? Where will production happen? How will we care for our sick and maintain order? How will we understand our environment and plan for the future? How will we feed ourselves? The 5 cities were an answer to these questions, an answer so good that we're still using it 5,000 years later. And that might be the real miracle, the thing that suggests there was something genuinely inspired, genuinely advanced, genuinely beyond ordinary human wisdom in their design. Because civilizations come and go, empires rise and fall, technologies are developed and forgotten and redeveloped. But the basic pattern, the 5-fold structure that endures, that persists, that reappears in culture after culture, age after age, always in slightly different forms but always recognizably the same. The Romans built temples to Minerva for wisdom, workshops for their legendary engineers, public hospitals and law courts, augurs to read omens, and massive grain distribution systems. The 5 cities reborn in another culture, another language, another time. Medieval Europe had monasteries preserving knowledge, guild halls for craftsmen, hospitals run by religious orders, astronomers calculating Easter and planning agricultural cycles, and the manna system producing food. Again, the pattern. Modern civilization has universities, research parks, hospitals and courts, meteorological services and planning agencies, and industrial agriculture. The names change, the specific forms change. But look carefully and you can still see the outline of Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar and Shuruppac. We can't not build according to this pattern. It's too fundamental, too essential, too deeply embedded in what civilization actually is. The 5 cities weren't just the first cities. They were the template that all subsequent cities would follow, whether we remember them or not. And maybe that's the final secret the 5 cities preserve. Maybe the real wisdom they offer isn't about the past at all. Maybe it's about the future. Maybe they're showing us what will remain after our own civilization falls, what will survive our own flood, whatever form that flood takes, because another flood is always coming. Climate catastrophe, nuclear war, pandemic, asteroid impact, civilizational collapse from any number of causes. The particulars differ, but the pattern is the same. Systems become unstable. Complexity outstrips our ability to manage it. Something gives way. The flood sweeps over. And when it does, what will persist? Not our specific institutions, probably. Not our particular technologies or cities or governments, but the pattern. The 5-fold pattern of wisdom, craft, healing, foresight and sustenance. Those who survive will need all 5. They'll rebuild all 5. They'll recreate the pattern, because it's the pattern that works, the pattern that's always worked, the pattern that was right the first time. The 5 cities are speaking to us from across a gulf of time, but they are not telling us about the past. They're warning us about the future. They're saying this is what survives, this is what endures, this is what you must preserve if you want anything to continue after the catastrophe. Preserve wisdom. Not just data, not just information, but the integrated understanding that allows you to use knowledge wisely. Build this into your systems as deeply as you can, make it redundant, encode it in multiple forms. Don't let it depend on any single institution or technology or individual. Preserve craft, the ability to make things, to transform materials, to create what you need from what you have. Keep the knowledge of how things work, how to repair them, how to build them from scratch. Don't let yourself become so dependent on complex supply chains that you can't function when they break down. Preserve healing, physical, mental, social healing. The knowledge of how to help people recover from trauma, how to maintain health, how to prevent disease, how to care for the vulnerable. Build institutions dedicated to this work. Train people in these arts. Make healing a central priority, not an afterthought. Preserve foresight, the ability to observe patterns, model systems, predict outcomes, plan ahead. Don't just react to crises as they happen. Try to see them coming. Try to understand the systems that generate them. Try to intervene before catastrophe strikes. Preserve sustenance, not just food, though that's crucial, but all the systems that support life. Clean water, clean air, stable climate, functioning ecosystems. These aren't external resources to be exploited. They are the foundation on which everything else rests. Damage them, and everything collapses. These 5 principles, these 5 pillars, these 5 cities reborn in every age. This is the message echoing across the millennia. This is what the Anunnaki, or whoever designed the system, understood. This is what they built into the very structure of civilization. And this is why the story of the 5 cities matters. Not because we need to know the exact dates or the precise locations, or whether the Sumerian king list is literally true in every detail. We need to know it because we need to understand the pattern. We need to recognize it operating in our own world. We need to consciously preserve and strengthen it before our own flood comes, because it is coming. That much is certain. Whether it takes the form of rising sea levels or nuclear winter or ecological collapse or something we haven't imagined yet, another catastrophe is approaching. The systems we've built are complex and fragile. The balances we depend on are precarious. The patterns that have sustained us are being disrupted. When the flood comes, what will we have preserved? What will survive? Will we be like Zusudra, who knew it was coming and prepared? Or will we be like the unnamed masses who drowned, who left no trace, who are remembered only as a number in the calculation of how many died? The 5 cities are asking us this question right now. Are we preserving wisdom? Are we maintaining our capacity for craft? Are we ensuring healing for all? Are we developing genuine foresight? Are we securing sustenance for future generations? If the answer to any of these is no, if any pillar is weak, then our civilization is unstable. Then we're building on sand, building in a flood zone, building without proper foundations. And when the storm comes, when the waters rise, what we've built won't stand. This isn't prophecy, it's pattern recognition. It's the same lesson the 5 cities learned 5,000 years ago. The lesson they're still trying to teach us if we'll listen. Civilization is possible. Cities can be built. Knowledge can be preserved. But only if you do it right. Only if you honour all 5 functions. Only if you build the full pattern, neglect any one of the 5, and you create a vulnerability, a fault line, a crack that will widen under stress until the whole structure fails. The ancient world learned this through catastrophe. We have the opportunity to learn it from their example, to see the warning they left us, to build better than they did because we have their pattern to follow. The 5 cities failed ultimately. The flood swept over them, the antediluvian age ended, but the pattern survived. And that's what matters. That's what they actually accomplished. Not the preservation of specific buildings or institutions, but the preservation of the pattern itself, the template, the design that would allow civilization to be rebuilt. We're the inheritors of that pattern. Whether we know it or not, whether we acknowledge it or not, we're living in the shadow of Eridu, working in the workshops of bad Tibira, seeking healing in the hospitals of Larak, planning our futures in the observatories of Sippar, eating the grain harvested from the fields of Shuruppac. The 5 cities never really ended, they just transformed. They became invisible, became so fundamental we stopped noticing them, became the air we breathe and the ground we walk on. They're the operating system running beneath our consciousness, the foundation supporting everything we build. And if we want to survive our own flood, if we want to leave something for the future that's worth preserving, we need to understand this pattern. We need to honour it. We need to strengthen all 5 pillars because the structure is only as strong as its weakest component. This is what the Sumerian king list is really recording. Not the reigns of impossible ancient kings, but the pattern that makes civilization possible. The 5 functions, the 5 cities, the 5 pillars upon which everything rests, after kingship descended from heaven, after the cities were established, after the pattern was set. Then the flood swept over, but the pattern survived. It survived the flood then. It can survive the flood now, whatever form that flood takes. But only if we recognise it, only if we preserve it, only if we build according to the design that was right the first time. Sleep now, if sleep will come. Let the patterns settle into your dreams. Let the 5 cities build themselves in the architecture of your unconscious. Eridu's wisdom, Bad Tibira's craft, Larak's healing, Sippar's vision, Shuruppac's endurance. They're all there, waiting in the dark in the deep waters of the Abzu, in the place where memory and myth become one. The 5 cities chose us as much as we chose them. And even now, even after all this time, even buried under meters of sand and millennia of forgetting, they're still teaching us, still shaping us, still whispering their ancient purpose into our dreams. Thank you for walking with me through these ancient places. If this story stayed with you, a gentle like helps others discover these mysteries. There are more ancient worlds waiting in the playlist whenever you're ready to continue the journey. Share your thoughts below if you'd like. What do you think really happened before the flood? Were the 5 cities the work of gods or something else entirely? Until next time, wherever you are in the world, whatever time it is, sleep well and dream deep. Let the 5 cities watch over you from their place in the past. Eternal guardians of the pattern that made us human. Good night.